What if everything you thought defined you, your wealth, your success, your empire, was actually the thing holding you back from true happiness? What if you had to choose between the life you've worked your entire existence to build and the chance to rebuild yourself from the ground up? When your darkest secrets are exposed and the world you've carefully constructed starts to crumble, will you fight to keep your power? Or will you risk it all to find redemption? Can you face the truth of who you've become and choose the painful path of change even if it means losing everything? If you're hooked on this story and want to see where the journey goes, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more twists, turns, and unexpected moments. Join us as we dive into stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Marcus Blackwell had everything anyone could want. The young CEO of Blackwell Enterprises, one of the most successful tech companies of the last decade, had power, wealth, and respect. His name was synonymous with ambition, his face often seen in glossy magazine spreads and at high-profile events. By 38, he had built a legacy, turning a small startup into a global tech giant. His success a beacon for aspiring entrepreneurs. His penthouse overlooked the city, a sleek marvel of glass and steel, a testament to his success. The fast cars, the designer suits, the extravagant parties, all of it made Marcus the envy of the business world. But underneath the shiny surface, cracks had started to appear. The empire he had so carefully constructed was beginning to crumble. His personal life had been reduced to shambles after a public and messy divorce from his high society wife. His addiction to alcohol, a secret he'd kept hidden from the press, had become harder to control, and he had increasingly found solace in the bottom of a whiskey glass rather than in the office or in the arms of the people who relied on him. Each day felt like a battle, and Marcus was losing. His empire was no longer invincible. Investors were growing wary, competitors were circling, and his board of directors had begun questioning his leadership. The company's stock was slipping, and despite his best efforts, the pressure of it all weighed on him, pulling him deeper into a spiral he couldn't seem to escape. The facade of the ruthless, successful businessman was starting to crack, and for the first time, Marcus felt truly vulnerable. It wasn't supposed to be this way. He had it all. Or so he thought. He'd spent years building his empire, only to watch it slowly slip through his fingers. He could feel his reputation fading. The image of the all-powerful CEO he had spent so many years perfecting was now just a hollow shell. And with every failed business deal, every disappointing meeting with his investors, the weight of his own guilt pressed down harder. By the time evening fell, Marcus had had enough. He couldn't face another round of negotiations or another barrage of bad news from his assistant. He needed a way out, if only for a few hours. The thought of returning to his empty penthouse, with its expensive furniture and cold, lifeless walls, made him shudder. So, he did what he had done far too often lately. He reached for the bottle. The whiskey burned as it went down, warming his insides in the way that only alcohol could. He drank to numb the feelings of failure that gnawed at him, to forget the endless reports of bad news that had plagued him all day. The world outside his glass seemed so far away, as if it no longer mattered. His phone buzzed on the table, but he ignored it. He didn't want to deal with the calls, the questions, the demands. He just wanted to escape. Hours passed in a haze. The bar was noisy, filled with people who seemed to have no care in the world, and Marcus envied them. They laughed and joked, unaware of the storm brewing inside of him. It wasn't long before he was stumbling out of the bar, his feet unsteady beneath him, the city lights swirling around him. He had no destination in mind, no plan. He just needed to keep moving, to keep pushing forward. The streets were quiet, but Marcus didn't notice. He barely registered the people walking past him, the hum of the city in the background. His mind was foggy, his vision blurry. All he could think about was how far he had fallen. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a man on the brink of losing everything. And it wasn't just his career at risk. His personal life, his dignity, even his sanity were all teetering on the edge. As he walked, he found himself veering off the sidewalk and into the street. The cool night air didn't help clear his head. It only made the darkness around him feel more suffocating. He was alone. His mind raced with thoughts of failure, betrayal, and regret. His steps grew unsteady, his body struggling to keep up with his racing thoughts. And then, just as quickly as it all began, his world tilted. He didn't see the curb. One misstep and he was falling, the world spinning around him. His hands shot out to break his fall, but it was too late. His body slammed into the pavement with a sickening thud. The pain didn't register at first. Everything around him just felt distant and hazy. He tried to lift his head, but the effort was too much. His vision darkened as he slumped onto the road, the cold concrete pressing into his face. For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. The world around him seemed to pause, the sounds of the city becoming muffled. His mind, clouded by alcohol, drifted between consciousness and oblivion. It was as if the ground itself was swallowing him whole, pulling him deeper into his own despair. He lay there for what felt like hours. No one stopped to help. Cars zipped past him, oblivious to the fallen billionaire lying in the street. It was as if he no longer mattered, a nameless figure discarded by the very world he had once controlled. The last thing he heard before slipping into unconsciousness was the faint hum of traffic, a reminder of how alone he truly was. Jessica Turner stood in front of her small mirror, adjusting the strap of her red dress. Her reflection seemed to mirror the life she led, hard, sharp, yet still holding on to some shred of softness. In the world she inhabited, vulnerability was a weakness, and for survival she had learned to bury it deep. The life of a call girl wasn't what she had dreamed of as a little girl. In fact, her childhood had been filled with hope, ambition, and visions of a future where she could escape the kind of life she found herself in now. But as fate would have it, she'd been dealt a different hand. Born to a struggling family in the outskirts of the city, Jessica had always known the sting of poverty. Her mother had worked long hours as a cleaning lady, barely making ends meet. Her father had been a dreamer, never quite able to hold a job, too caught up in his own world to care for his family. They were a family that scraped by, living paycheck to paycheck, always wishing for something better. As a teenager, Jessica had found herself on the edge of adulthood, determined to break free of the cycle of hardship. She had dreams of becoming a fashion designer, of one day opening her own boutique, and living a life where she didn't have to worry about money. But dreams didn't pay bills, and reality had a cruel way of knocking them down. When her mother fell ill, Jessica took on jobs working as a waitress, a cashier, and anything else she could find to cover medical expenses. The cost of her mother's treatment far surpassed what Jessica could afford, and in desperation she turned to a life she'd never imagined for herself. She became a call girl, not by choice but out of necessity. Her resolve was tested every day. She despised the life she lived, but in a cruel twist of fate, it gave her the financial freedom to support her mother and herself. Jessica had been in the industry for 3 years now, long enough to harden her heart against the world that tried to use her. She never allowed herself to get too attached to anyone or anything. She kept her personal life separate from her work, keeping her dreams tucked away in a small corner of her mind where they couldn't be trampled. Yet every night as she finished her shift, she couldn't help but wonder what could have been. What if she had stayed on the path to something better? What if she had followed her heart instead of her desperation? But those were questions for another day. That evening her phone buzzed with a message from her usual client. It was the same as always, paying well for her time and offering little more than an exchange of physical intimacy. But tonight, Jessica wasn't in the mood for the usual routine. She felt drained, the weight of the world pressing down on her, but she knew the job had to be done. Her mother's bills weren't going to pay themselves. As she was about to leave her apartment, a sudden thought crossed her mind. What if she called in sick tonight? What if she just stayed in, watched some TV and pretended for a while that her life wasn't a series of transactional encounters? The idea felt foreign, but she couldn't shake it. She shook her head, banishing the thought. She had responsibilities. Her mother needed her. She had no choice. But just as she was about to step outside, her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a text, it was a call. Her client was asking for a last-minute job, one that paid handsomely. The urgency in his voice left her with no room for hesitation, and she agreed to meet him. Stepping into the cool evening air, Jessica made her way down the bustling streets of the city. Her heels clicked on the pavement, echoing in the night as she blended into the crowd. The flashing neon lights of bars, clubs, and shops only reminded her of the life she had chosen, the life she had no choice but to endure. The city was alive, but she felt hollow like a spectator in her own life. As she turned the corner, her eyes caught a glimpse of something out of place. A figure lying motionless on the road. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a man unconscious, crumpled in the street like a discarded piece of trash. At first, Jessica thought it was just another drunk, another casualty of the city's late-night chaos. But something stopped her from walking away. She paused, her gaze fixed on the man's face. He was impeccably dressed, well-tailored suit, shiny shoes, a silk tie. But his face was pale, his features contorted in unconsciousness, and his body lay as if it had been abandoned. There was something about the man's stillness, something that pulled at her, a sense of helplessness that made her reconsider walking away. Without fully knowing why, Jessica found herself crossing the street. As she approached him, she bent down, checking his pulse. He was breathing, but barely. She quickly assessed the situation. He didn't look like a homeless man or a petty criminal. His clothes and demeanor suggested wealth, maybe even power. Yet here he was, abandoned and vulnerable. Her instincts kicked in. This man, whoever he was, needed help. And in that moment, Jessica's resolve began to shift. She couldn't walk away, not with him lying there, vulnerable and alone in the streets. Maybe it was a momentary lapse in her hardened exterior, but something about him called out to her. Kneeling beside him, Jessica gently shook his shoulder. "Hey," she said softly, trying to rouse him. "Can you hear me?" He groaned slightly, but didn't respond. She cursed under her breath, trying to think quickly. She couldn't leave him there. He needed medical attention at the very least. With a deep breath, Jessica decided she couldn't let him stay there, not on her watch. He might be a stranger, but in that moment he wasn't just some rich, lost soul. He was a person, and she would not abandon him like the rest of the world seemed to have. Her decision felt almost instinctual. She wasn't sure why she was doing this, but it didn't matter. She would take him in, help him, and figure out the rest later. Jessica's apartment was a modest space, tucked away in the corner of the city, a stark contrast to the glittering, opulent world Marcus had come from. The walls were painted in soft tones, with second-hand furniture scattered around, giving the place a sense of warmth despite its smallness. There was no luxury here, just the practicality that came with survival. As she helped Marcus inside, his body leaned heavily against her, a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. He was tall, towering even in his weakened state, and she could feel the power he once held slipping through his grasp like sand. His suit was soaked in rainwater, and his hair was matted against his forehead, a stark contrast to the pristine businessman she imagined he once was. But Jessica had no time to pity him, nor did she want to. She placed him on the couch, keeping a safe distance. As she looked at him, her instinct screamed at her to leave. He was just another rich, entitled man who had everything handed to him on a silver platter, while people like her had to fight tooth and nail for every scrap. She could feel the resentment bubbling inside her, the kind of bitterness that had built up over the years, shaped by the unfairness of life. But despite her initial hesitation, she couldn't bring herself to let him suffer. His breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttering as he stirred. Something about his vulnerability struck her. There was a rawness to him now, an authenticity that contradicted the image of the cold, polished CEO she had in her mind. For all the wealth and privilege he'd lived with, he was now a stranger in need, lying helpless in front of her. It didn't feel right to leave him like this. With a sigh, Jessica decided to take control of the situation. She moved around him efficiently, gathering a blanket and a glass of water. As she draped the blanket over him, she noticed how much older he looked now. His face, once smooth and sharp with confidence, was worn, the lines deepened with stress and perhaps something more. She couldn't quite place it, but the expression of anguish on his face made her pause. She softened for a moment, staring at him, the full weight of his suffering crashing into her. Whether she wanted it to or not, she had seen so many people at their lowest, but there was something different about Marcus. He was drowning in his own demons, and it was clear he wasn't used to feeling this way, powerless, vulnerable. It was almost humanizing. Marcus groaned and stirred again, his eyelids flickering open. For a moment his eyes were glassy, unfocused. "Where am I?" His voice was raspy, hoarse from the alcohol and the rough night on the street. Jessica looked at him coldly, unsure whether she should even acknowledge him. He was just another rich man after all. But despite her own inner conflict, she responded, her voice flat. "You're in my apartment. You passed out on the road, and I brought you here to keep you from getting worse." She couldn't mask the bitterness in her tone, but she forced herself to keep it neutral. Marcus's brow furrowed as if he couldn't make sense of her words. He blinked several times, trying to clear the fog from his mind. As his eyes met hers, something flickered in them. Recognition. Then, as if the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, his face slowly morphed into a look of disbelief. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice stronger now, though still fragile. Jessica hesitated. She had no idea what kind of response he expected, but she couldn't help feeling some sense of triumph over this man who had always been so untouchable, so invulnerable. "I'm just someone who found you lying in the street." Her words were sharp, but she didn't care to soften them. "I don't have the time to be your savior or anything, so don't get any ideas." Marcus blinked again, as if trying to recall the events that led him here. But nothing seemed to add up for him. The weight of his situation slowly settled into his body, and the reality of his fall from grace began to sink in. His shoulders sagged, and his eyes fluttered closed for a moment, lost in thought. Jessica watched him for a while, her gaze calculating. She had heard the whispers about Marcus Blackwell, the tech mogul, the CEO who had it all, but hearing it from the media and witnessing it in person were two entirely different things. The man in front of her wasn't the polished, perfectly put-together billionaire she had imagined. No, this was someone else, someone she hadn't seen before. The curiosity gnawed at her even though she tried to suppress it. Who was he really beneath the suit and the news stories? What had driven him to such desperation? She couldn't ignore the vulnerability that now radiated off of him, even if her resentment for him still simmered beneath the surface. It wasn't long before the answer came to her in the form of a name. As he started to regain some clarity, Marcus spoke again, his voice quieter this time, tinged with both defeat and confusion. "Marcus Blackwell," he said, barely above a whisper. "You must have heard of me." Jessica froze. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone had. Marcus Blackwell was a name that commanded respect, a name that had once been synonymous with power, wealth, and success. His empire had seemed indestructible until now. She'd seen the headlines, the gossip in tabloids, the articles about his latest business moves, his public divorce, and the recent scandals surrounding his company. But here he was, broken and helpless, and the man before her seemed nothing like the billionaire CEO she had read about. It was surreal, almost too much to process. The stark contrast between the public figure she had known and the man now lying in her apartment was jarring. The idea of Marcus Blackwell being vulnerable, lying at her mercy, was something she could hardly wrap her head around. Jessica's heart began to race, but she forced herself to calm down. She wouldn't feel sympathy for him. Not yet. Not after everything she had been through. She took a deep breath and focused on the task at hand. She had no time for his brokenness or his story, not when there was work to be done. But as she moved to make sure he was comfortable, a strange feeling bubbled up inside her. Was it empathy? Or was it just curiosity? The need to know more about the man who had it all and lost it just as easily? She couldn't quite tell, but one thing was for sure. Marcus Blackwell, the billionaire, was no longer the untouchable figure he once was. He was just a man now, and Jessica would decide what to do with him. As the night stretched on, Jessica did her best to keep the situation under control. Marcus was still disoriented, but his movements had become less erratic, and he was beginning to come to terms with his surroundings. His breathing was steadier now, and he wasn't groaning in pain anymore. He was awake, but there was a distant look in his eyes, one that made him seem like he wasn't really there at all. She kept a safe distance, just enough to give him space, but close enough in case he needed help. She busied herself with the mundane tasks, checking the locks on the door, refilling his water glass and making sure the lights were dimmed. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, filled with the weight of their respective worlds, one of privilege and success, the other of survival and hardship. But it was the silence that made Jessica uneasy. She was used to solitude, but this kind of silence, heavy with unspoken words, felt like a pressure against her chest. The quiet seemed to pull at something deep inside her, something she had buried for years. Marcus finally broke it. "I'm sorry." His voice was hoarse, raw, the words weighed down with meaning. "I didn't mean to put you in this position." Jessica glanced over, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You didn't put me anywhere. I chose to help you." The words came out colder than she intended, but she wasn't ready to soften just yet. There was no room for sympathy in her world. He turned his head, meeting her gaze. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Then Marcus, still lying on the couch, let out a long sigh, his eyes closed, his hands pressed against his forehead, as if to hold the weight of his thoughts at bay. "It's just all too much." He looked up at her, vulnerability cracking through the tough exterior he had so carefully crafted. "Everything's falling apart. I thought I had everything under control, but it's like I've lost it all, you know." Jessica watched him closely. She knew the feeling all too well, the sharp, gnawing fear that came with the realization that nothing in life was permanent, not even the things you worked hardest to keep. But she didn't want to get involved, didn't want to pity him. Still, she could see it now, the person beneath the facade, the man who had clawed his way to the top, only to find that the top was a lonely, fragile place. It wasn't pity that tugged at her now. It was something else, something unfamiliar. "I get it," she said quietly, leaning against the counter. "Sometimes the harder you try to hold on to something, the faster it slips away." Marcus's eyes met hers, and for the first time since their strange meeting, there was a softness in his gaze. The arrogance, the walls, the expectations, all of it seemed to melt away, leaving just a man who had been broken by life in ways he hadn't expected. "I used to be someone," he murmured, the words heavy with regret. "But now I'm just lost." Jessica didn't respond right away. Instead, she walked over to the window, her back to him, trying to find the words. She had heard stories of billionaires and their empty lives, of people who seemed to have everything but were suffocating beneath the weight of it. But to see it in front of her, to witness it in the man who had once been the epitome of success, it was different than she had imagined. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, as if the earlier edge had faded. "You know, I don't think it's the money that makes you lose yourself." She turned back toward him, her eyes steady. "It's when you forget what you really want. When you stop fighting for something that's real." She paused, biting her lip, her thoughts drifting for a moment. "I was just trying to survive for a long time, and I forgot what it was like to dream." The words hung between them. She didn't know why she said it, why she shared that piece of her story with him. But somehow in that moment it felt like the right thing to do. Marcus didn't speak right away, but he nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. "I think I forgot how to dream," he admitted quietly. "I used to have big ideas, big plans, but somewhere along the way I got lost." The conversation shifted then, from the surface level of pity and pain to something deeper, something neither of them had expected. They began to talk, really talk, about their lives, their struggles, and their regrets. Marcus shared more than he had intended, revealing pieces of his soul he had never allowed anyone to see. He talked about his childhood, his rise to power, and the loneliness that had haunted him from the very beginning. His father had been distant, a figure whose expectations had shaped every decision Marcus made. The pressure to succeed had never been about his own dreams. It had always been about living up to someone else's. Jessica listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix it. She just listened, her eyes softening with each word. For the first time, she realized that beneath the cold exterior, Marcus Blackwell was just as human as anyone else. He had fears, desires, and doubts just like she did. But the more he shared, the more the pull between them grew. It was almost magnetic, this connection. He was vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected, and for the first time in years she didn't feel alone. There was something about this man, about his struggle, that mirrored her own in ways she couldn't articulate. But just as quickly as the connection formed, the tension between them grew. Marcus's addiction, the one thing that had dragged him down into the darkness, began to resurface. His need for control, for validation, was stronger than his will to change. It was a battle he had fought for years, and in that moment she saw it, his desperation, his need to feel powerful again. Jessica knew that if he didn't face this demon, he would fall back into the same patterns, the same self-destructive cycle that had brought him to her doorstep. She could see the battle in his eyes, the internal war waging within him. And yet she wasn't sure how to help him, how to push him past it without being dragged down herself. "Marcus, you need to face this," she said, her voice stern yet caring. "You can't outrun it forever." He looked at her, the sadness in his eyes palpable. "I don't know if I can. Every time I think I've got a grip on it, it pulls me back." She nodded, understanding the weight of his struggle. It wasn't about just surviving anymore. It was about truly facing the parts of himself he had buried. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if he was ready to make that choice. But deep down, she knew this night was the start of something that neither of them could predict. Something that might just change the course of their lives forever. The first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow over the apartment. Marcus was sitting on the couch, his posture straighter now, but his face still looked worn, as if the night had aged him by years. His eyes had regained some of their sharpness, but there was a quiet despair that lingered beneath the surface. His body was no longer trembling from the effects of alcohol, but the weight of the night's revelations had left its mark on him. Jessica stood by the small kitchen counter, making herself a cup of coffee, her movements slow, deliberate. She hadn't been able to sleep much. Her mind raced with the conversation they'd shared, the connection that had unexpectedly formed between them. But now, as she glanced over at Marcus, her thoughts turned to practicality. She didn't have time for sentiment, not with the life she led, and certainly not with someone like him. She took a deep breath and walked over to him, setting the cup of coffee on the table in front of him. He looked up at her, his gaze flickering with uncertainty. "Thanks," he muttered, but there was something more in his voice, something like gratitude, tinged with hesitation. "You're welcome," she replied simply, standing a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes steady. She hadn't let her guard down completely, but she wasn't about to push him away either. Not yet. Marcus took the cup in his hands, the warmth of the coffee contrasting against the chill that had settled in his chest. He stared at the liquid, lost in thought. "You don't have to do this, you know," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost like he was testing the waters. "I'll pay you. I know this isn't your regular thing." Jessica cut him off before he could finish. "Don't," she said sharply. "You think just throwing money at me is going to make everything better. That's what got you here in the first place." Her tone wasn't harsh, but it carried an edge, one that wasn't just about him. She wasn't about to let him buy his way out of his mess. Marcus flinched at her words, but she didn't care. He needed to understand that there was no quick fix, no easy out. He set the cup down on the table, eyes flicking up to meet hers. "So what do you want from me? You've helped me so far. What's in this for you?" His gaze was searching, but there was an underlying challenge in his voice. It was a question he was already answering in his head, but he needed to hear it from her. Jessica didn't look away. "I'm not in this for the money, Marcus." Her voice softened just slightly. "I'm offering you something else. A way out. A chance to really change if you're serious about it. But it's not going to be easy. And it's not going to be on your terms." She leaned in slightly, making sure he heard every word clearly. "I'll help you. I'll help you get back on your feet, but only if you prove to me you can fight this. You can't keep relying on your money to fix everything." "That's not going to work anymore." Marcus blinked, a flicker of something crossing his features, surprise, disbelief, maybe even a little annoyance. You think I need some kind of therapy or something? You think I've got some grand epiphany coming? You don't get it. His voice was edged with frustration. I don't have the luxury of time. I've built everything, and I'm about to lose it all. You don't understand the kind of pressure I'm under. It's not about just fighting some demon. It's about surviving. It's about keeping this whole damn thing from falling apart. Jessica's jaw clenched, but she held her ground. I get it, Marcus. I really do. But you've been hiding from your demons for too long, letting them control you. You want a quick fix, a band-aid for something that's rotting beneath the surface. But I'm telling you, you have to decide if you really want to change, and you need to show me that you're willing to fight for it. He sat back, running a hand through his hair, frustration mixed with something else, guilt, shame, fear. The pressure of his situation was evident in every line of his face, every subtle movement of his hands. But Jessica saw something more than the businessman in crisis. She saw a man who was unraveling, a man who needed something more than a business deal or a bailout. He needed a second chance, but whether or not he was ready to take it was another question. Do you really think I can change? He asked quietly, his voice betraying a vulnerability he hadn't shown before. Because I don't know if I can. There was something raw in his admission, something that made Jessica pause. She took a deep breath, her eyes softening slightly. I don't know, Marcus, but if you want to prove it, if you really want to make a change, then let's make a deal. Not a financial one, not one that you can just pay your way out of. She took a step closer, her voice firm but steady. I'll help you, but you need to prove you want this. You need to fight, not just for your company, but for yourself, for who you are beyond all the power and money. If you're ready to do that, we can figure it out together. The tension in the room thickened as Marcus processed her words. He was used to deals, to controlling situations with his wealth and influence. But this wasn't something he could buy. This was something he would have to earn. It wasn't about corporate strategy or manipulation. It was about vulnerability, trust, and real change. The silence between them stretched, both of them caught in the gravity of the moment. Jessica wasn't sure if he'd take her offer, if he was ready to commit to something that would cost him more than just his pride. But she wasn't going to make it easy. She wasn't going to let him walk away with a quick fix. He needed to face his own demons, just like she had to face hers. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. All right, he said, his gaze steady but tinged with uncertainty. Let's make this deal. Jessica nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips. Good, but remember, this isn't going to be easy for either of us. He met her gaze, the weight of his decision sinking in. I know, but I'm willing to try. And just like that, the deal was made. Neither of them knew exactly where it would lead. But in that moment, they both realized that their lives were now intertwined in ways neither could have predicted. A billionaire and a call girl, worlds apart, yet somehow on the same path toward redemption. But the road ahead would be anything but simple. The stakes were high, and neither of them could afford to back down. The deal they made was risky for both of them, a gamble that could either lift them to new heights or drag them further into the depths of their own struggles. As the night stretched on, the tension between them simmered, a complex mix of desperation, hope, and the promise of change. But for the first time in a long while, both of them had something to fight for, and that was all they really needed to begin. Marcus stood in the corner of the conference room, his back straight as he scanned the documents laid out before him. The sound of pages turning was the only noise, the room otherwise silent save for the soft hum of the air conditioner overhead. The numbers on the financial report weren't good, not at all. His company, once a powerhouse in the tech world, was still in the midst of a crisis. And no matter how many meetings he attended, how many plans he tried to put into motion, the reality was sinking in. He wasn't going to be able to fix this overnight. The pressure felt immense, more than it ever had before. He could feel the weight of his company's failure crushing him with every passing second. But this time, it wasn't just about saving Blackwell Enterprises. This time there was more at stake. The personal toll was even greater. His addiction, the demons he had buried for years, kept surfacing at the most inopportune moments. Every glass of whiskey he turned to, every time he felt the pull of the alcohol in his veins, it was as if he was being dragged back into the darkness he had fought so hard to escape. But he couldn't afford to go back there. Not now. Not when he had made a commitment to change. The echoes of his father's voice, harsh and demanding, were louder than ever in his mind. His father had never been satisfied, never been proud of him. Marcus had spent his whole life trying to prove that he was enough, that he could live up to the expectations set before him. But all it had done was lead him down a path of loneliness, addiction, and broken relationships. His ex-wife's face flashed in his mind, followed by the cold, empty stare of his former business partner, who had long since left him behind. Marcus had built a tower of success, brick by brick, only to watch it crumble. Marcus, Jessica's voice broke through his thoughts, soft yet firm. She had entered the room quietly, her presence grounding him. She always did. You need to step away from this for a bit. You can't keep going like this. He didn't respond immediately, not wanting to admit that he was teetering on the edge of another breakdown. He didn't want to show her how fragile he was. But Jessica knew. She always did. You can't fix everything in one night, she added, her tone gentler now. You have to take a step back or you'll lose yourself again. Marcus took a deep breath and finally looked up at her. His gaze was heavy, full of the shame he carried. I don't know how to stop, he admitted, his voice low. I've spent so much time trying to keep everything together, to fight for control. But I don't have control anymore, do I? Jessica didn't respond immediately. Instead, she crossed the room and sat down beside him. Close but not too close. She had watched him struggle with his addiction, his self-destructive habits, the way he would push everyone away when he needed help the most. She could see the cracks in his armor, the parts of him that he tried so hard to hide from the world. You don't have control over everything, she said quietly. But you can control what happens next. You can take small steps. You're not alone in this, Marcus. I'm here. Her words hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment Marcus's resolve wavered. He had built walls so high around himself, never allowing anyone to truly get close to see the man beneath the CEO. But with Jessica, it felt different. She was the only one who seemed to understand the cost of ambition, the weight of success that left you hollow inside. As he sat in the silence that followed, his mind wandered back to his past. Memories that had been locked away for years came flooding back. His father's harsh criticisms, the pressure to be perfect, the loneliness that had followed him like a shadow. The pain of those years was still sharp, still raw. The failed relationships, the empty nights, the feeling of never being enough. Marcus, Jessica's voice broke through again, softer this time, as if she could sense the storm inside him. You can't carry this burden forever. You have to face it. You have to forgive yourself. But Marcus wasn't ready to hear that. Not yet. I don't know how to forgive myself, Jessica, he whispered. I've done too much damage. She shook her head. You're not the same man who made those mistakes. You can't keep punishing yourself for something you can't change. You can only work toward being better. Her words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and for the first time Marcus felt something shift inside him. He was still broken, still far from being whole, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. Maybe he could start again. The door to his past was heavy, and Marcus wasn't sure if he was ready to walk through it. But Jessica's steady presence beside him gave him a sense of comfort. She didn't judge him for his failures. She didn't ask for anything in return. She simply saw him, broken and flawed, and still chose to stay. As Marcus wrestled with his own demons, Jessica, too, faced her own internal battle. She had been running from her past for years, burying it deep beneath the life she had created for herself. But now, as she helped Marcus confront his struggles, the weight of her own past came crashing down on her. Her decision to become a call girl wasn't one she had made lightly. It was survival, plain and simple. When she had been left with no other choice, when the world had seemed to close in on her, she had made the hardest decision of her life. She had chosen to sell a piece of herself in exchange for the security that her mother needed. It was a choice she had never been proud of, but it had been the only option that made sense at the time. but the shame of it had followed her, haunted her every step. She had spent years pretending it didn't matter, convincing herself that this was just the path she had to walk. But every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a reflection she didn't recognize. A woman who had traded her dignity for survival. A woman who had allowed herself to become a pawn in a system she didn't believe in. As she sat there with Marcus, her heart pounding in her chest, she felt a pull toward him, a pull that went beyond sympathy or compassion. He was like her in a way. He had built his life on the expectations of others, only to watch it all fall apart. She had lived her life for the sake of survival, but neither of them had ever really lived for themselves. For the first time in years, Jessica felt like she was starting to see her own worth, through Marcus's eyes and through the connection they were building. She wasn't just the call girl, the woman who existed for others' pleasure. She was someone who had dreams, someone who deserved more than just to survive. And Marcus, he wasn't just the billionaire CEO. He was a man who had faced his own failures, his own flaws, and still had the courage to rise again. In that quiet moment, amidst the shared vulnerability, both of them began to understand that maybe, just maybe, they were both worthy of redemption. They had both built their lives on the wrong foundations, but they could rebuild, together. The morning light cast a soft glow over the city as Marcus sat at his desk, staring at the documents in front of him. Things were starting to look up, slowly but surely. His company's financials had stabilized, his meetings were productive, and for the first time in months he felt like he was gaining control. It was a fragile victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. His mind was clearer than it had been in years, the fog of addiction lifting as he fought to reclaim his life and his empire. But as the saying goes, things were too good to last. Marcus's phone buzzed on the desk in front of him. He reached for it, expecting another update on the business, maybe something about a new partnership or a promising client. Instead, the name on the screen made his heart sink. David Calloway. David was a name from Marcus's past, a name he hadn't thought about in years. Once they had been partners, allies in the cutthroat world of business. But things had soured between them over the years, and the fallout had been bitter. Marcus had always suspected that David had an agenda, but he never knew just how far he would go to bring him down. Marcus took a deep breath and answered the call. "Marcus," David's voice came through, smooth but laced with malice. "I see you're doing well. A little too well if you ask me. I thought I'd remind you of the skeletons in your closet. You know, the ones you've been trying so hard to bury." Marcus's stomach twisted. "What the hell do you want, David?" David chuckled. "Oh, don't be so hostile. I'm just calling to check in. I hear your company's making a comeback. Quite impressive for someone who's been living with a few vices, don't you think?" The threat was clear. David had always been able to play the game with a smile, but Marcus knew better now. He had seen this side of David before, the manipulative, power-hungry side that used anything to get what he wanted. And now it seemed like he was going to use Marcus's past against him. Marcus's fingers clenched around the phone. "Don't even try it," he warned. "If you think for 1 second I'm going to let you drag me down again, you're wrong. I've worked too hard to get back on my feet." David's voice was low, almost a whisper, but the threat was unmistakable. "I'm not trying to drag you down, Marcus. I'm just reminding you of your weakness. I know about your little problem. You've been slipping, haven't you? I can make sure the world knows just how far you've fallen." There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "And trust me, that'll make all your progress look like a joke. No one will trust you again." The call ended abruptly, leaving Marcus holding the phone, his heart racing. It was like a shadow had just fallen over everything he had worked for. David wasn't just threatening him. He was threatening everything Marcus had built. And if Marcus didn't play this right, if he didn't handle this carefully, he could lose it all again. His mind was reeling as he tried to process the weight of what had just been said. David had always known how to push his buttons, how to exploit his weaknesses. But this time it wasn't just about business. This time it was personal. Jessica's voice cut through his thoughts as she entered the room, her presence grounding him. She could see the storm brewing in his eyes and the tension in his posture. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern lining her voice. Marcus put the phone down, his hands trembling slightly. David, he's back. Jessica raised an eyebrow. David Calloway? Marcus nodded. He knows about my past. He's threatening to use it against me. She didn't say anything at first, but the worry was evident in her eyes. She had seen Marcus struggle, seen the fight in him to keep his addiction at bay and to reclaim what he had lost. The thought of David, someone from Marcus's past who knew how to manipulate his weaknesses, was a direct threat to everything they had worked for. But for Jessica, it wasn't just about the business. It was about Marcus, the man she had come to care for in ways she hadn't expected. You can't let him win, she said, her voice firm. You've come too far to let him bring you down again. Marcus's gaze flicked to hers, a mix of gratitude and fear in his eyes. I know, but David, he knows how to play this game better than anyone. He can take everything I've worked for and make it look like it's all just a lie. The tension between them thickened, both of them feeling the weight of the situation. But Jessica wasn't backing down. You're not doing this alone, she said, her tone soft but resolute. I'm here, Marcus. We'll figure this out together. Her words should have been comforting, but they only made the situation feel more real. Jessica had already been through so much of her own pain, her own struggles. Now she was risking everything to help him. There was a part of him that wanted to protect her from this, to shield her from the mess he had created. But he knew that wasn't possible. Not anymore. The stakes were higher than ever now. It wasn't just about business. It was about their future, their trust in each other and their shared vulnerabilities. That evening, Marcus found himself facing his greatest test yet. He had to protect his empire, but at the same time he had to confront his demons. David's threats were no longer a distant possibility. They were a reality. If Marcus wasn't careful, if he couldn't keep his addiction in check and face the mess of his past, David would use it all to tear him down. The fear of losing everything again gnawed at Marcus. But it was the fear of losing Jessica that cut deeper. She had stood by him when no one else had, when he was at his lowest, and now she was risking her safety to help him. Could he truly protect her from this? Could he stand tall, fight back, and keep the fragile progress they had made? Jessica could see the uncertainty in his eyes, but she didn't flinch. She would stand by him no matter what. This wasn't just about his redemption anymore. It was about theirs. Together they would fight. But as the night stretched on, Marcus's resolve began to waver. The fear of losing everything, the temptation to fall back into old habits, lingered like a shadow over him. Could he really do this? Could he overcome the weight of his past, the demons that had haunted him for so long? And more importantly, could he protect the one person who had come to mean more to him than anything else? The test of loyalty had begun. For Marcus, it wasn't just about business anymore. It was about who he had become and who he was willing to fight for. The soft glow of the city's lights filled Marcus's penthouse, the grand view of the skyline doing little to soothe the storm raging inside of him. His empire, the very thing he had worked his whole life to build, was hanging by a thread. The threat from David Calloway was no longer just a vague possibility. It was now a real looming danger. His company was on the edge of collapse, his personal demons still clawing at him, and the weight of it all was threatening to crush him. But there was something else weighing heavily on his heart, the decision he had to make. A choice between two paths, both fraught with consequences. On one hand, he could fight for his empire, for the status, the wealth, and the power that had defined his entire life. It was his life's work, his legacy. On the other hand, he could walk away from it all, leave the world of high-rise buildings, corporate meetings, and endless demands behind, and choose something more meaningful, something that was real. He could choose Jessica, choose the chance at redemption, at rebuilding his life from the ground up. But that came at a high cost, one that he wasn't sure he could afford. His mind raced, torn between the two choices. The pull of his company, of everything he had built, was so strong. It had defined him for so long, given him purpose, and he couldn't shake the thought that without it, he would be nothing. But then there was Jessica, the woman who had stood by him when no one else would, the woman who had seen past his wealth, his status, and into the man he was beneath it all. She had given him the one thing he had lost, Hope. He stood at the window, staring out at the lights of the city, the vastness of it all. His mind went back to the nights he had spent drowning his sorrows in whiskey, the hollow conversations with people who only cared about his success, his name. And then there were the quiet nights he had spent with Jessica, talking, sharing, finding something real, something he had thought was lost to him forever. But as he stood there, the weight of the decision pressing down on him, he knew it wasn't just about what he would lose. It was about what he could gain. The chance to rebuild, to fight for something that wasn't built on the broken foundations of his past. He had spent so long trying to hold on to what he had, but maybe that wasn't what mattered anymore. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his lawyer. David is making his move. He sent a letter to the board, threatening to expose your addiction if you don't step down. It was as if the universe had made the choice for him. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what this meant. He could fight, but it would cost him everything he had worked for, the reputation, the control, the power. Or he could let it all go, walk away from the wreckage, and choose a life of meaning. One where he didn't have to hide behind a mask of wealth and status. The door to his penthouse opened softly, and Jessica stepped in. She had been waiting for him to make his decision, but the silence between them said everything. She had known this moment was coming. She had known that eventually Marcus would be forced to choose. She walked over to him, her eyes filled with concern but also determination. "You're not alone in this, Marcus," she said quietly, her voice steady yet tender. "But you need to make the choice. What's more important to you?" Marcus turned to her, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he was about to lose. "I don't know," he confessed, his voice raw. "I've spent my whole life building this empire, this world of wealth and power. But now it feels like I'm losing myself. And I don't know if I can keep fighting for something that's slowly killing me." Jessica reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to fight alone," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to fight for the empire. You can fight for yourself, for the man you want to be, not the man they expect you to be." The words hit him like a jolt. It was the truth he had been avoiding, the truth that he had never allowed himself to fully embrace. The empire he had built, the wealth and success he had worked for, none of it had brought him the happiness he had hoped for. None of it had filled the emptiness inside him. But this, the connection he had found with Jessica, the chance at redemption, at real change, this was something worth fighting for. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, his mind made up. He had been fighting the wrong battle all along. The empire, the power, the money, they had never been enough to fill the void inside him. But this could be something real. This could be his chance at redemption, not just for the world to see, but for himself. With a deep breath, he made the choice. "I'm done," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'm walking away from it all. I'm letting go of the empire. I want to be a better man, for me, for you." The weight that had been pressing down on him seemed to lift as he said the words out loud. For the first time, he felt the freedom that came with releasing the past that had defined him, the past that had held him captive. He didn't need to be a billionaire anymore. He didn't need to be a CEO. All he needed was a chance to live a life that mattered. Jessica's eyes softened as she stepped closer to him. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice gentle but her gaze unwavering. "I'm sure," Marcus replied, his voice stronger now. "I want to build something real, something that's mine, not the world's mine." In that moment, Jessica saw the change in him. It wasn't just about the decision he had made. It was about who he was becoming. The man who had once clung to wealth and power was now choosing something more meaningful, something that would change both of their lives. But as the tension between them began to ease, a new question emerged. What would they do next? Marcus's empire was gone, but so was the man who had built it. They were both standing at the edge of something new, something uncertain. But for the first time, the uncertainty didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a possibility, a chance to rebuild. And then, just as Marcus thought he could finally breathe, there was a knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to expect, but when he opened it, he was met with a surprise that would change everything. David Calloway stood there, a smug grin on his face, but something was different. He didn't look like the man who had once controlled everything in Marcus's life. "I see you've made your choice," David said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, of doubt. "But don't think for a second that this is over. You've chosen to give it all up, and you're still going to pay for that." Marcus stood tall, looking David in the eye for the first time without fear. "I've already paid," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "And I'm not going back." In that moment, Marcus realized that the journey wasn't about the empire he had lost. It was about the life he had finally chosen, the life that had meaning. And for the first time, he felt truly free. Jessica stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm, and together they faced whatever came next, knowing that their greatest victory wasn't in what they had given up, but in the love and redemption they had found together.